Hello, this section is entitled Configuring Google Kubernetes Engine Application Monitoring and Logging. So the first thing to know is that you don't actually have to configure it necessarily because it's already pre-installed by default on any clusters you create today. It used to be something you had to enable directly, but it's there already. You don't have to install any software, it's just there. So it's really more about learning how to just access logging data and monitoring data, which is monitoring meaning metrics. So the way we can do this is we'll first run a workload and then try to look at the logs it generates and then look at the metrics it generates. So let's look at the workload in particular. Again, we're keeping things super simple by just using pods. So this pod is very similar to the ones we did, last one we did, except for I named it logging. It's still using Ubuntu. But here, what it's doing is instead of just running without doing anything, this is actually running, the command is, it's running bash with the command, and then the arguments is the script, basically. And the script is basically looping through endlessly every 30 seconds, generating a hello world output. So we were going to look first at the logging, which is what this is doing, and then we'll look at the monitoring and metrics. So to do this, we do kube control apply logging, okay, and that creates the pod. We can do kube control get pods. We can see that it's running here, right? So the first thing we want to do is look at the logs of it. Now this is running every 30 seconds, so I can't remember if it's, I think it logged already. So if I do, this is one way of getting to the logs is through this command, logs logging, and I've misspelled it. And you can see that it's already run 2 hello world outputs, right? So this log, this mechanism of logging basically relies on the fact that the pod is still running, right? And and it only keeps a certain history of it. The downside of this style of logging is that if this pod goes away, then you can't find the logs of the pod because it's basically goes away with the pod. So this is more like an ephemeral logging. So one thing that's nice about GKE is they already have built-in integrations with cloud logging so that you can actually get those logs in cloud logging, and then they persist past the lifetime of the pod. So the way we do that is we go into our project. This is the cluster's running in training main. So I go to cloud logging. I think I already bookmarked this just earlier, so that's why it's here. Normally you have to scroll through this long list to find it. So log explorer, and the key, so this is an empty query. So you got to know what to query for. And in this case, I have already got it in here. I'm going to copy and paste, and I'll walk you through what these are. So what this is says, look for, and then, so within cloud logging, there's various resource types. There's K8 container, which gives you details around the container, because the logging is actually happening from the container. Then I'm being precise. I'm telling it what cluster the logging's from. There's a thing called namespace. We talked about that briefly earlier. And of course the pod name we just saw. So if I run this query, here you can see all my hello world outputs. Now some of these were from right now, and then some of these, I was doing this exercise earlier. So some of these were from my last attempt right now. So there's probably only 4 of these are from now. Oh, I don't even know how many. Let's see, actually 48. Yeah, I got like 5 of them now, right? So these hello worlds correlate with this output here. So there's like the logging, and that matches up with this. And the difference again is that if I delete this pod, then I can no longer use kube control logs logging because that pod no longer exists, yet these logs persist. So that's the primary benefit of using cloud logging for collecting the logs from your containers. Now there are other resource types. So for example, pretty sure if I get rid of this, I put pod. Now this is kind of a sidebar. I don't think I even have it in the right. So some of these, so one of the things that also you can get is get at pod level logging. And if you look at these might look familiar to you. So successfully assigned default logging to this cluster, container images present, created container Ubuntu, started Ubuntu. If you remember, the stopping was from my earlier example. If you do kube control get describe pod logging, you will observe that this logging, this messages, these events right here, that is actually also captured in the pod logs. So you can get a history of this. And again, these logs here are somewhat transitory. They'll eventually roll off the system. They're hard to get to after a while, but as they're captured in cloud logging, you can see them long term. Now you can also get, there's one other level of logging that you can get, which is another sidebar. You can get cluster level logging, but these are going to be things that don't make a lot of sense to you or me for that matter. These are events generated by the cluster itself, and it's usually mostly used for debugging, I guess if you're working with Google, right? But again, there's three kinds of logging. There's cluster level, we just saw, pod level, or container level. Okay, enough about logging. The last topic we wanted to cover is metrics. So again, you didn't have to do anything here other than just go into monitoring. So if I go to monitoring overview, for example, I don't want to be there actually. Why did that not go to cloud monitoring overview? There's monitoring. So in here, there's a dashboard. Now, when you install GKE, I can't remember if I talked about this, but you automatically get a certain dashboard, so you don't have to write your own like metric queries. There's a bunch of pre-made kind of UI around monitoring GKE clusters. So if you just look at this here, you can see it knows about the cluster, right? And it knows about these things called namespaces. It knows about the nodes, the 3 nodes that are running. Workloads, we're not going to see our pod here because, long story short, we're not using what's called a deployment, so you're not going to see it there. But you will see under pods, you'll see our logging pod, because that's how we deployed essentially a pod, kind of a bare pod. So if you go to pods, some of the things, I mean, you can look at events, which are, I guess there's none here, but the key thing, you can look at logs here too, I think. Yeah, there's the pod logs, right? Actually, it looks like it's a combination of pod logs and container logs, right? That's interesting. But the reason why I usually come here is for metrics. And you can see that, let me see if I can collapse this. So you can see metrics about, let's sort of high level it, right? You can get container level metrics, pod level metrics, or node level metrics. Again, kind of the 3 levels of sort of containment here. And you notice that first you'll say, well, why aren't I getting any data for CPU request utilization? That happens because we are currently not using one of the features of Kubernetes called setting resource requests and limits for our pod or containers. So we're not going to see any data here, but you do see CPU usage time. So you can actually see that this container, actually this is by container. So our Ubuntu container is barely using any CPU essentially. And you can see things like memory usage. Again, the utilizations you're not going to get, but you're going to see just general data about the performance of your pod, of your containers, right? And then just so you know, pod metrics, usually you can see things like volume usage because that's what's remember, multiple containers share the same in the same pod share the same networking. So that's why the networking lives at the pod level, not the container level. Okay, well, that's really, I think, all we were going to cover here. This is kind of just a brief introduction to the fact that GKE, out of the box, supports logging to cloud logging and to metrics to cloud monitoring. And there's actually a convenient dashboard here that allows you to kind of not have to write those queries directly. Now, I guess another kind of quick sidebar is if I was go back to container, CPU, and pick this one, which I guess it did. No, it didn't do. Container metrics. Come on. I guess I have to select it somehow. Why is it not? I'm having some UI issues, which is super annoying. Okay, hang on. Okay, container metrics, container CPU. Well, apparently it's not changing on me. What I was going to show you is you can also, there's an option here where you can view the metrics in Metrics Explorer, which is kind of the more raw way of looking at metrics if you want to fine tune it. So like, for example, open link in a new tab. You'll see the same data, but then you can actually monkey around with the query itself. So here's the same data, and then here's the actual query that was being used for this metric. This is a convenient way of kind of getting all these filters right, because this can be confusing. Here you have to specify the project ID, by the way, because Metrics Explorer here, this training monitoring workspace, actually collects data from multiple projects. So here you actually have to specify the project. Okay, that's it for this video.